My mic is working. Well, I'm really excited to be here in Miami. I just want to say a big thank you to Michelle, who's done a really excellent job, putting all this together. It's been really exciting to kind of watch her and see everything that she's done over the past 8 months or so down here in Miami. I've been watching from afar from Mississippi, but she's an amazing community builder and just excited to see all the stuff that she's been working on. So it's been really fun to watch. I just want to give her a round of applause and thank you for putting all this together. Also, Gabe, who's one of the organizers, big fan of react.js, which is a really great community. Anyway, I could go on, but I'm going to stop. I'm going to have something to talk about here. So I just want to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Nader Dabit. I'm a developer relations engineer working in the blockchain space for the last year at a company called Edge and Node. It's a team that created a protocol called the Graph, and they've now opened up a new company, which is where I've worked for the last year. And we focus on venture capital in the Web3 space. We do public goods. We help maintain Web3 protocols like the Graph, and we're building out a couple of applications that we'll be releasing in the next 6 to 12 months. And I'm here to talk about building full-stack applications in the Web3 space. And if you watched Alex's talk earlier, or if you've kind of paid attention to a lot of the hype and stuff that you've been hearing about, you've probably heard the term Web3. I'm hoping to kind of just give my explanation of what I think this means and whether or not you might be interested in it based on what I'm talking about will hopefully be something that you walk away from this talk with. I'm trying to kind of dial it down into a perspective from a developer, mainly a front-end developer, because I've been a front-end developer for most of my career, for the first 7 years or so, building web and mobile applications, both with React, React Native, even going back to Angular and jQuery. So the term Web3 is kind of loaded at this point, in fact, and I'm not even sure if this is the best term for us to be using, but I'm going to use it because that's kind of where we are today. And when people describe Web3, you probably hear dozens of different explanations and definitions, but to me, the core of what Web3 is that it's the stack of protocols that enable fully decentralized applications. Now, what does that mean? Because that might not mean anything. Well, let's kind of dive into that a little bit more. When you think about the way we build applications, we typically have these building blocks that we use, and building blocks that we typically reach for are abstractions that are higher level than maybe what we would have used 5 or 10 years ago. So at one point, we were writing raw JavaScript, and then we started compiling that, and then we started seeing frameworks like React, and now we're seeing frameworks like Next.js that are using React as a primitive. What we are essentially using are these building blocks that we kind of have and that we reach for, and we don't really think about a lot of the abstractions that we use these days. And when you think about the internet itself, it's been essentially enabled and made possible by these decentralized protocols that we kind of use every day that we may or may not actually be using directly, but that we're definitely aware of, and maybe we have actually used these directly. So when we think of some of these protocols that we are talking about here, HTTP, FTP, SSH, TCP, et cetera, one of the reasons that these protocols have been so successful is that they're widely adopted and they're not subject to change. If I build an application and I launch it and I have a website and it's accessible via HTTP, I know that anyone in the world can access that website without any middleman. We can just expect that it's going to work. Now, as the internet has been built out, there are certain pieces of functionality that we just don't have built into the internet. Things like payments, state, compute. For payments, we typically have banks, which are often combined with things like Stripe and PayPal, which are very, very, very complex, not only on the software space, like in how these applications actually run to enable people to access these payments and things, but fundamentally, if you think about someone like me living in the United States, if I want to send money to someone in Palestine, for example, how complicated it actually is for that to happen and how many things go right and how much code is actually underlying something like PayPal and whatever they're using, it's very, very brittle and it's very complex. But that's what we've built to kind of enable us to be able to send digital value between parties. When you think about state and compute, we typically have databases that are running in the cloud, or maybe they're running in our garage somewhere, but they're centralized and our application goes down. But this is kind of where we are based on the current tech stack. So the way I look at Web3 and what we kind of are seeing today with the new innovations is that we now have additional protocols that allow us to implement some of these features natively that all of us can kind of rely on a single API, and we can have a database or like a set of data that everyone in the world can kind of like access. And that's kind of the way I look at Web3. Yes, it does involve blockchains often, but not always. Yes, it may or may not involve tokens or cryptocurrency, but I kind of bucket peer-to-peer databases or what you might call off-chain storage when people talk about Web3 into this category. So to enable these new pieces of functionality, we have smart contracts, we have these distributed ledger technologies that have been enabled by the current innovations that we've seen, and we have more mature peer-to-peer databases, and we just have the maturization of all this stuff put together. Though it is very still early, and that's something I'm going to talk about, some of the downsides to some of this stuff in just a moment. So what are the characteristics enabled by all of these things? So like the definition I gave doesn't really mean a whole lot, but the characteristics enabled by these new technologies, these new building blocks, are kind of what you often hear when people talk about Web3. So you have this idea of decentralization, not only of the software, the web infrastructure. So we're not only decentralizing the servers, but we're also often decentralizing ownership. So you see different business models that are popping up. You see different ways of communities organizing, like Developer DAO, which is a community-owned collective that builds software and finds jobs and does a lot of different things. You have this new idea of digital scarcity. Whether you buy into that or not is a different story, but it is something that has been enabled by distributed ledger technologies and Web3 technologies. You have this idea of native payments in state. So if I want to send a payment from me to someone in Palestine, no longer do I have to go to my house, get my ID, go to the state, get an ID, or like go to my house and get like some type of thing saying I live at this address, go get an ID, then go to the bank, and then go home, open an email address, then connect my bank, and then PayPal. And then they on the other side of the earth have to do all that, and then we have to find something that works together. Instead, they can actually go to Chrome and download an extension and give me their address, and I can send them a payment within about 5 minutes. There are no gatekeepers. There is no centralization that is there to kind of like stop someone from making that happen. It just works. And when you kind of like experience that and not living here in the United States, or maybe having family or relatives that are in parts of the world where this is like an actual huge deal, then you kind of look at some of these ideas around payments a little differently maybe. You have this idea of displaced intermediaries. So you have DeFi protocols that are doing tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars in transactions that are run by 10 or 15 people, as opposed to banks that have thousands of people flying all over the world in jets and huge buildings and stuff. You have this idea of decentralized web infrastructure. That's some of the stuff I want to talk about today around the actual tech stack. You have this idea of self-sovereign identity, meaning that you can own your own identity and have control over that. And most importantly, when we're thinking about building applications as developers, you have this idea of open composable backends that are free to consume. The data is completely open by nature. It's trustless, and you have this idea of immutability. So are these things good or are these things bad? I mean, shit, I don't know. But that's what we're about to talk about in just a moment, right? I kind of want to like explain that. So like, what are the types of applications that people are building with this stuff? Well, you see financial applications being the core use case, right? Because that's kind of like the initial value proposition that was enabled by Bitcoin, which was like the first blockchain, you could say, that became popular. But since then, we've seen much more innovation happening there. The idea of being able to actually run code on these decentralized protocols. You have this idea of decentralized web infrastructure protocols. As someone that's been working in the serverless space, the big value proposition behind serverless is that you can just like spin up an API endpoint, and you don't have to actually deal with and worry about all the underlying infrastructure. You can expect that it's going to work. What if we took that a step further and said, not only do I have this endpoint running in US East 1, but what if we never had to worry about US East 1 going down, because 99% of the network could go down, but my endpoint is still going to work because we now have our application distributed across this entire network of computers. Gaming is something that you heard maybe them speaking of earlier with Axie Infinity. You start seeing some innovation there. That's still fairly early. DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations, are really exciting. I am very, very involved, and I'm also the founder of a DAO called Developer DAO. We've placed dozens of people in six-figure jobs. We've done a few different in real-life events. We've had a completely free online conference. We've done a lot of open source software, but it's a community-owned collective, and it's pretty interesting seeing different spins on DAOs. You have this idea of tokenization of physical assets, which is still fairly early, digital art, and then you have this idea of the Web3 applications. So Audius is kind of like a Web3 version of Spotify. You have a Web3 version of a lot of different applications that we use to being talked about today. But most importantly, if you walk away with this talk with one thing, I think it's that this idea is that when people talk about Web3 on the internet, on Twitter especially, you hear people that absolutely love it and think it's going to save the world. Literally, people have said that. And then you have people that absolutely hate it and they think it's literally the worst thing in the world. When in reality, it's just a technology. It's building blocks that we're being able to build stuff with. And there are trade-offs there. There are good things that you can do with this. There are bad things. There are things that this technology is good for, and there are things that this technology is bad for. You wouldn't want to say, I'm going to build everything in this way. Instead, the same way that mobile came around, and it enabled us to build new types of applications on mobile devices. Machine learning and AI came around. It enables us to build new types of applications. People that became specialized in mobile, became specialized in AI and ML, unlocked more earning potential. I think that's the way I look at this technology. It's not going to replace everything. It will disrupt certain industries, but it's not going to replace everything. Instead, I, as a developer, am always learning new things to increase not only my earning capabilities, but just my curiosity. And this has piqued my curiosity in the last year, and it's been really fun to work with. So let's talk about building Web3. And I want to first talk about a blog post that I wrote that was based on research that we did at Edge and Node at the company that I work with. We hired researchers that were there before I got there, that worked until the end of December of 2021, that were researching and trying to understand what this tech stack actually looks like. Because I, as a developer, understand things in terms of, I want to have a database. If I want to build an application, I need these primitives, a database. I might need some compute. I might need a file storage layer. I have these things that I can reach for, and I can essentially build out 99% of the types of applications that I want, and then that other 1 to 5% is going to be kind of the differentiator. So what does that tech stack look like in Web3? Well, we kind of dove into that. And there are literally thousands of technologies out there that are claiming to solve certain problems. So it's extremely confusing as a developer to kind of come into this space and try to understand what's going on. Because there's a few different reasons. One of the reasons is that it's just a lot of people building stuff and experimenting in public. But one of the downsides of Web3 technologies is that a lot of them are tokenized. So people have a financial incentive to tell you that something is going to be good, when in reality it may or may not be good. So it's up to the people that kind of have a long-term, play here, a reputation that they want to build to kind of explain and try to make this clear for people. So we were hoping to kind of explain, in our opinion, what some of these technologies were. So when we kind of did this, we essentially dialed it down to 20 or 25 technologies that you could kind of just look at, but we tried to really make it even smaller than that, and I'm going to kind of talk about breaking these apart in a few different areas in just a moment. But when we think about a traditional web application or a mobile app or whatever, I knew that if I could have these primitives like storage, web hosting, data, identity, and some type of compute layer, then I can build out a Twitter, I can build a Facebook, or at least I can build a prototype, right? And then from there, that's kind of where you go. So what does that core web infrastructure look like, or that core infrastructure look like in Web3? Well, you have some things that overlap in theory. So you have identity and authentication, but it's instead of asking for someone's email and their phone number and their address or whatever, You instead provide a public-private key pair, and then using that public-private key pair, you can essentially have an identity that may or may not be tied to your own credentials. That's kind of up to you. But instead of signing in with your email, you're now signing in with this signature that you kind of sign a transaction that is essentially not, there's no actual like ledger or any tokens involved. It's just signing a transaction. So with identity and authentication, that carries over really well. This idea of file storage carries over really well. If I build an app on Amazon, I might use S3 for AWS or something like that. We have those same primitives in Web3, and I'm going to talk about a couple of those in just a moment. Web hosting is the exact same. You still need that. But a few things are different. One of those is this idea of smart contracts, obviously. That's kind of like the core main difference that you often hear people talking about. Solidity, developers are paid really well. They're really high in demand. And that's something that we didn't really have in the traditional web space. We also have this idea of public data. So when we think about one of the really great APIs that we, as developers that have been around for a long time, maybe have used in the past and we stopped using, the Twitter API at one point was actually really, really fantastic. And we even saw people building $10, $100 million businesses on top of the Twitter API. But when a company has a very valuable platform and they start seeing other companies building more successful platforms using their data, then they just decide to cut it off, and there's really nothing you can do. But what if we instead had public backends that we could share, that we could know could never go away? We know that we could always access them. That's one of the really powerful ideas around Web3, and that's one of the really, as a developer, interesting areas of this technology that I think is important to kind of like understand. We also have this idea of a database that is optimized for both read and write operations in the traditional web space. We've had databases like, SQL, NoSQL, RDS. You have all these different types of Postgres databases that have kind of evolved. You see iterating and improving over time. They've been working on this technology for dozens of years, and it's extremely optimized at this point. You can hit a DynamoDB table and query it millions of times per second and have no issues at all. And these technologies are extremely, extremely mature. In the blockchain space, you do not have a good querying layer. All of the innovation is happening at the transaction layer. So when you hear new databases or new blockchains being released or new pieces of functionality talked about, it's often talking about how many transactions per second, what is the block time, what is the transaction cost. And it's all about the write operations. But because this data is written over the course of time in blocks, think about something like Ethereum, where they've been writing data for 7 or 8 years. What if you want to query data going back to the very beginning of that? There is no built-in querying layer. So what you end up seeing is people actually indexing the data that they want from a smart contract address into a database, and then kind of like offering an API on top of it, or protocols like the Graph, where I work. That's kind of what we do. We offer a decentralized protocol for developers who can just like define their data model in GraphQL. They can define their smart contract address, deploy it to our network. We index that data and serve it up in a GraphQL endpoint. So yeah, those are the three main differences in the general like ideas around the basic stack. But most importantly for people here maybe is that like if you're a front-end developer and you want to dive into this stuff, your front-end skills are 100% transferable. Whether you're a web developer or a mobile developer, you're still essentially using HTTP requests to send and query data and things like that, but with a small caveat. And there are a lot of jobs open right now in the front-end space. We're typically used to dealing with REST or GraphQL endpoints. The main difference in the blockchain space is you have this idea of an RPC endpoint, but there isn't a lot of difference there if you dive into some of the docs. Instead of having a post operation or a delete operation, you have this idea of a transaction, which is a write operation. And in addition to what I was talking about earlier with indexing and querying, you can read a blockchain network directly at a certain point in time and get data from a function within that contract. But if you want anything more sophisticated than that, you need some type of querying layer. So you would probably end up either having your database that you query from, or if you're building in Web3 and you're interested, you might use something like the Graph, which is giving you that GraphQL endpoint. So what is this Web3 tech stack? I'm going to kind of walk through a few different pieces. I talked about the graph. This is kind of the protocol that we work with. This is the indexing and querying protocol, allowing you to define your data model and your smart contract address using GraphQL. Deploy it to our network. We offer you a GraphQL endpoint to query it. Ceramic Network is starting to become really, really interesting and very, very, like, a lot more mature lately because they've released a lot of new updates and they even have more stuff coming. So Ceramic Network offers a mature peer-to-peer database. So if you want to have something that isn't important enough to be written on chain, if you want to just have something like tweets or something like that, you might use something like Ceramic, and it's free to use, and it has its own, token, and well, actually, it doesn't have a token yet, but it has its own like network and incentivization model that they will be launching a token at the end of the year to kind of power the network, but the transactions there are completely free. Live streaming. LivePeer is a video and live streaming platform that allows you to essentially build something like Twitch, but it's run on a decentralized network. And from what I understand, it's at least 10 times cheaper than using something like AWS. For file storage, there are a couple of different options out there, but the two most popular right now are IPFS and Arweave. IPFS is interesting because it's completely free to use, but you don't have any data guarantee. So the idea with IPFS is that if your data is being accessed, it should still be available. You can use something like a pinning service, which is where you pay extra to kind of make sure your data is available, but it's kind of like a pain. And we've now seen more innovations happening, and I think Arweave is the one that I'm more excited about. And Arweave is a protocol that allows something that we've never really seen before, this idea of permanent storage. So if I store something and I pay a single transaction cost, I can access this 5, 10 years later, and I can expect it to be there. Now, this is extremely interesting for stuff like web hosting. So what if you want to serve a static site, and you want to just deploy it, and you want to access it, forever and not have to pay hosting? You could use something like Arweave, and you're starting to see things like Vercel or whatever be built on top of these decentralized protocols that kind of offer that type of functionality, which is really interesting to see. Radical is a decentralized Git hosting protocol. So if you've used something like GitHub, it's a hosted version of Git. Git itself is decentralized, but most of us use a hosted version of it. Radical is a decentralized Git hosting protocol. When we think about identity, we might be used to giving our email address, or we might be using something like OAuth with Google or Facebook. In Web3, you're typically using something called a wallet, even though the name wallet kind of sucks. I think they should come up with something better than that because it serves as more than just payments. It also serves as your identity and your reputation. MetaMask and Rainbow are typically used for Ethereum Virtual Machine, which is a few dozen different blockchains. And then Phantom Wallet is a great wallet for Solana. For identity, we have this new project that was released a few months ago from Ceramic called Self-ID. It allows people to kind of change information based on their address. So if you want to associate your address with a profile picture or some type of username, you can do that. And then finally, the development environments that you might want to use to kind of build out the actual smart contracts. Hard Hat, Foundry, and Truffle are really great for writing Solidity, and then Anchor is a great one for writing Rust on Solana. An interesting project also that's been recently released. Is anyone here, who here has used Homebrew? All right, one of the most interesting things about Homebrew is the creator, Max Howell, has two really cool stories that I always hear about. One of them was him getting rejected at Google, where everyone there was using Homebrew because he didn't pass the technical interview, and he was salty about that, rightfully so. And then the other story is that he created trillions of dollars worth of value, and he couldn't make enough money off of his open source project, so he had to go get a job. Both of those stories are very unfortunate. He created something called T, though, and launched it a few weeks ago, and he's essentially trying to build out a version of some type of package registry where there is some type of incentive that allows package maintainers and open source contributors to earn money from their code, preventing things like left pad and all these other situations that we've seen, but also just hopefully bringing more equitable opportunities for open source developers. A few of the characteristics that he kind of listed were that it's going to be free to use, and it's already, I think, released. I'm not sure exactly the details of the progression of it, but packages will be immutable. They will always be available. Releases will be signed by the maintainers themselves. There's a native utility token that powers the network. And most importantly, package maintainers will be compensated via network rewards. So that's going to be cool to watch. So if you want to get started, to me, the best way is checking out the $10 billion or more available worth of grants, meaning that you can apply for a grant and get paid while you're keeping your day job, just to kind of dip your foot in the water and learn. Near Protocol has $800 million in grants. Harmony One, $300 million. The Graph, we've already given $100 million in the past 12 months. We have a new grant wave every couple of months. You can do stuff like build out tutorials. You can build out open source. You can do whatever you want. Just send a proposal, and most of these treasuries are incentivized to increase the network of their protocol. So these grants often, like if they're aligned with that, then you can often get paid to kind of like build stuff and experiments. And then there's Gitcoin, which is a place for you to kind of look at existing bounties that other protocols have kind of already set up, and you can claim those or bid on those to kind of get paid. And we're kind of getting close to being done on time, so I'm going to kind of like wrap this up with maybe a couple more slides and then we'll be done. But like me as a developer, like all this stuff is really interesting, but I think the most exciting thing to me as a developer is kind of like this idea of this open and public backends. We're used to open source software. Like that's been really, really, really great and valuable. But we've never really been able to share each other's applications or data, right? Like, yes, you can open up an API, but we can't expect to build a business on top of that. You often hear people say, if you build a business on top of someone else's APIs, you're at the, you're essentially like depending on them for whatever happens, and they can shut it down, and you don't really have any recourse, right? So what if instead we had these backends that we could all use and we could all share and we could all build upon? I love this idea of primitives. Every new primitive that I can learn that is powerful, I can kind of add it to the collection of things I already know how to build, and they're adding to my capabilities of like my earning potential, but also my building potential. And I think that this is like, very core to that. And what we're really talking about here is live open source infrastructure, but what we're really, really talking about is like Web3 APIs, which I think is a cool like name for it that we haven't really heard people talk about a lot. But I think that's kind of going to be a big thing that we're going to see a lot of. And traditional APIs are typically centralized. They're immutable, meaning they can be changed, and we can't really like know that that's going to happen. They're brittle. The API fluctuates over time, and it can also be closed at any time. Web3 APIs are distributed, meaning that they are not running on a single point of failure. You typically have them running on a decentralized network of nodes. They're open and composable. They're free to consume, meaning like there is no payment wall in front of them. They're open by nature. They're trustless, and they're immutable. DeFi is a good example of this in action. You have over $1 trillion of transaction flow through these handful of different protocols, but you now see protocols building on top of each other and then protocols building on top of them, and you can kind of take advantage of someone else's backend and kind of like build stuff, which is pretty cool. So the biggest, most important part of this for me lately is to kind of talk about the trade-offs, because I think when you hear people talk about Web3, they only talk about the good stuff, when in reality there's a lot of bad stuff. It's very nascent, it's very new. There are a lot of things that we just don't know. There are a lot of experiments happening that people will basically try to say that they're amazing, but we really don't know that those things are good or not. They're just experiments. I think what we need in this space is more honesty about those sorts of things. There's too much hype right now still. Protocols are slower to build and iterate on than centralized solutions. You heard Alexis, if you were in that talk earlier, kind of like hint to this, that people, they prefer centralization often because it's just easier. Financial incentives, we've essentially lowered the barrier to entry for building financial applications, but we've also lowered the barrier to entry to scammers. So you have all types of scammers coming in and building all types of crazy things and doing all types of bad stuff. The wallet user experience is very bad right now. There's really no way around that, like to kind of like sugarcoat that. Coming from something like OAuth to a wallet and being able to manage like your tokens and stuff, we just need to improve that. There's a lot of like disinformation and maximalism. So you often hear people that are in the Web3 space that will tell you that the thing that they're building is going to save the world. Those types of things are really toxic in my opinion. All right, so that's it. I want to invite everyone here to consider coming. If you want to learn more about all this stuff, we have a big event happening June 2nd through 5th. It's called Graph Day. It's in San Francisco. We're also going to have a 3-day hackathon. If you want to come out and you can't really afford it, the tickets or anything like that, we're also sponsoring flights, hotels, and stuff for a handful of participants. So you can go and just sign up there if you're interested in coming, and you might be able to get one of those. And it's going to be at the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, which is a really beautiful place. So that's it. Thank you for checking this out, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.